What if the man who promised you everything, letters full of warmth, promises of a new life, a shared future, rejected you for something you could never change? What if the thing he couldn't accept was simply who you were? The wind was sharp as the train screeched to a halt in the frozen breath of late afternoon. Silver Creek's platform sat quiet beneath a dusting of snow, steam hissing from the engine like a warning. Elellanena Morgan stepped off the last car, her boots crunching against the planks, the only passenger descending in that moment. A battered suitcase hung from her gloved hand, and her tall frame, nearly 6 feet even without the heel of her boot, cast a long shadow across the cracked wood. She stood taller than every man she'd known in Boston, taller than her father, taller than her teachers, taller than any suitor who ever looked at her and saw novelty before disappearing behind a polite excuse. Her height had always preceded her, walking into rooms before she did, drawing stares, mutters, and not-so-subtle assessments. But she hadn't traveled all the way across the country for approval. She came for something else entirely. Silver Creek wasn't a place you stumbled upon. It was carved out of the Oregon pines by grit and calloused hands, a town of crooked signage, muddy streets, and the smell of sawdust thick in the air. But to Ella, it was supposed to be a beginning. For 6 months, she'd exchanged letters with a man named William Prescott, a sawmill owner with a neat hand and an old world tone that seemed careful and considerate. They'd never spoken of her height. They'd shared recipes, talked about books, the weight of winter, the kind of boots that lasted a season. He'd written things like, "I don't seek fireworks, Miss Morgan. I seek steadiness." And to Ella, who had grown weary of trying to dazzle, it felt like relief. Now she smoothed the skirt of her wool dress, forest green and hand-stitched, as the whistle gave one final cry behind her. Her heart pounded, not from nerves exactly, but from hope. It was a fragile, trembling kind. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind and waited. No one stepped forward. The platform was nearly empty, save for a few loggers lounging near the saloon across the street. They looked up when she arrived, and one of them whistled, long and low as if sizing up a tree worth felling. Ella ignored them, adjusting her grip on the suitcase. Then finally, a man emerged from the general store. He looked about 40, sandy-haired, well-kept beard and solidly built, though he didn't reach her chin even in his boots. He removed his hat as he approached, eyes scanning her face, then dropping too quickly to her boots and back again. "Miss Morgan?" he asked, the question cautious. "Mr. Prescott," she said, offering her hand. "It's good to finally meet you." He took it, but let go too quickly, like her touch had startled him. His eyes flicked up again, more slowly this time. "You didn't mention your stature," he said, the word like something sour in his mouth. "No," she replied evenly. "I didn't. You're taller than me." "I am." A pause. Then he stepped back, shaking his head slightly. "I need a wife who fits the role." "The role? A woman should look up to her husband," he muttered, "not the other way around." Behind him, one of the loggers let out a chuckle. Ella didn't flinch. She had prepared herself for disappointment. But not like this. Not so fast. Not so blunt. "You wrote that you wanted a partner," she said softly. "Someone to build a life with." "I wanted a normal woman," he said, then immediately winced. "I mean someone of ordinary stature." "You want someone small enough to not be noticed," she said, her voice like cold iron. "I'll arrange your return passage," he said quickly, already retreating. "Eastbound train comes through in the morning." "I spent everything." "I had to get here," she said, her voice still steady, though her hands had begun to shake. "I'm sorry," he said, but he wasn't looking at her anymore. And then he was gone. The loggers were still watching. One called out, "Need help with that bag, miss? Looks tiny in those big hands." Laughter. Ella gripped the suitcase and stepped off the platform, each step heavy but deliberate. The suitcase, once filled with hope, now seemed to drag behind her. But she didn't stagger. She didn't look back. She walked past the general store, past the saloon, past the church with its flaking paint, out toward the edge of town where the trees rose like guardians. She sat on a log, the cold seeping into her coat, and let the silence wrap around her like a quilt that couldn't quite keep out the hurt. Then from behind her, a voice. "Quite a view from up here, huh?" Startled, she turned. A man stood a few yards away, sleeves rolled, arms crossed. Taller than her, by a few inches, a thick beard, bright, calm eyes. His voice was like cedar, warm, unbothered. "I didn't mean to sneak up," he added. "Name's Gabriel Blackwood. I run the northern logging camp." She looked at him warily. "There's a boarding house run by Martha Webb," he said. "Decent beds, hot meals. I'll walk you there if you want." "Why would you help me?" she asked, not accusing, just tired. "Because no one deserves to be left stranded," he said simply. "And folks like you, the ones who don't fit the mold, they're usually the ones who change everything." She stared at him for a moment, unsure whether to believe it. But something in his voice, or maybe his eyes, said it wasn't flattery. It was just truth. She nodded. "All right, Mr. Blackwood." "Gabriel," he said with a smile. They walked side by side into Silver Creek's fading light, and for the first time since stepping off that train, the sharpness of the town's gaze didn't hurt quite as much. She was still alone. But not completely, and sometimes, in the coldest moments, a little warmth is all you need to stay standing. She didn't cry, not on the platform, not when William Prescott turned his back and muttered apologies that sounded more like escape routes, not when the loggers laughed, tossing careless words into the bitter air as if her heartbreak was a game for their amusement. She didn't cry when she stepped down from the boards into the thick, sucking mud of Silver Creek's main street, the hem of her green wool dress darkening with each step. Her heart beat loud in her ears, not from panic or shame, but from something deeper, something steadier. She had known disappointment before, but never like this. This time it wore a face she had trusted. The words played in her head again. "I need a wife who fits the role." As if partnership were a costume, a part to be played on a stage built by men like him. She had written to him in good faith, poured herself into each letter, careful, not to sound desperate but open enough to be honest. And yet none of that mattered. The second he saw her, really saw her, all those months of connection folded like paper in the rain. Still, she kept walking. She passed weathered buildings, and faces that turned just a little too slowly to pretend they weren't watching. Silver Creek was small enough that a stranger was always news, and a woman like Ella, tall, alone, carrying herself with a grace that defied apology, was practically an earthquake. One man outside the saloon tilted his hat and muttered something she didn't catch, but the laughter that followed carried. She didn't look at them. Her chin remained level, eyes focused on the edge of the town, where pines stood tall and quiet like sentinels. The pain didn't crest in waves. It sat low and heavy like a stone under her ribs. She hadn't realized how much she'd wanted this, how much she had risked on the hope of being seen without being made small. That hope, so carefully cultivated, over every letter exchanged with William, had withered the moment he stepped back and said, "You're taller than me." Not as a joke, not even with surprise, with disappointment, as if she had deceived him by being who she was. Her boots left wide impressions in the snow-muddied path as she made her way beyond the last house, where the hum of town began to fade and the silence of the forest took over. She found a fallen log near the tree line and sat, placing her suitcase down beside her. The fabric was wet now and her hands ached from the cold, but she didn't move. It would have been easy to let the rejection break her. She could have cried. She could have shouted. But something inside her refused. She had spent too many years apologizing for her size, for her voice, for her presence, for her ability to fill a room without meaning to. She had mastered the art of shrinking, of angling her body to take up less space, of stooping through doorways, of laughing off cruel comments like they didn't burrow into her bones. But not today. Today she had stood tall, had offered her hand in good faith, and been cast aside like a mismatched item in a shipment. She pressed her gloved hands together and blew into them. The air turned her breath into fog. Everything she owned was in that suitcase. Every thread, every scrap of fabric she'd saved, every coin, every letter. She could leave. She could walk, right back to the train in the morning. Take the next ride east. Disappear into another city where she'd be seen as odd, overlooked, tolerated at best. Or she could stay. For what, though? The town had already decided what she was, a curiosity at best, a spectacle at worst. And yet, the forest didn't care about her height. The wind didn't whisper judgment. The trees didn't shrink away. She sat a long time like that, listening to the hush of snow falling in the distance. She sat with her heartbreak, let it breathe, but didn't let it take her voice. The rejection burned, yes, but the fire it sparked didn't consume her. It lit something in her chest that had been dim for too long. Dignity wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It simply stayed standing when everything else tried to push it down. So she sat tall, even as the sun dipped lower, and waited for whatever came next. A voice stirred the silence. "Quite a view from up here, huh?" She turned, startled but not frightened. A man stood a few yards away, half in shadow, sleeves rolled, arms crossed with the easy confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. He was tall, taller than her, which hardly ever happened. Broad across the shoulders, beard thick but trimmed, and eyes the kind of blue that didn't ask for attention but held it anyway. "I didn't mean to sneak up," he said, taking a step forward. "You looked like you were trying to disappear into the pine." She gave a half smile, more instinct than intent. "Maybe I was." "Well," he said with a shrug, "if you succeed, you'll be the first person to ever win a fight with Oregon timber." A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable. He didn't push. He didn't stare. "Name's Gabriel Blackwood," he added after a moment. "I run the northern logging camp. Most folks around here just call me Blackwood." She stood, slowly, brushing snow from her skirt. "Ella Morgan." He nodded once, respectful. "Miss Morgan." She waited for the pause. The moment his eyes flicked up, registered her height, turned puzzled or amused or politely startled. But it didn't come. "I saw you come in on the train," he said. "Not many do. Silver Creek's not much of a destination unless you've got work waiting." "I did," she replied. "I thought I did." Something in his expression shifted. Not pity, not quite. Understanding, maybe. "You had a name waiting for you," he guessed. "Yes. Didn't go well?" "No," she said. "It didn't." He didn't pry. Didn't ask what had been said, what had broken, or what she planned to do now. Instead, he glanced over, his shoulder toward the dim lights of town. "Martha Webb runs a boarding house at the corner of Mill and Ash. She's got rooms, hot food, and enough opinions to warm a person through winter. I can walk you there if you want." She hesitated, not because she doubted him. He didn't seem the type to make empty offers, but because something in her still bristled at the idea of needing anyone, especially now. "Why would you help me?" He looked at her like the question surprised him. "No one deserves to be left stranded," he said plainly. "Not in a town like this. And not because they scare small men." That made her pause. Her breath caught, not from the cold. "Besides," he went on, as if the compliment hadn't even been one, "folks like you, folks who don't fit the mold, are usually the ones who change everything." She studied him. His words weren't smooth, they weren't rehearsed. He said them like facts, like someone who didn't have the time or the inclination to sugarcoat anything. "All right," she said finally. "All right," he echoed, and together they walked back toward the faint golden glow of Silver Creek. The town didn't look any different than it had an hour before. The streets were still crooked, the windows dim, the mud thick, but somehow, beside Gabriel Blackwood, it didn't press in so tightly. She still didn't know what she would do in the morning. But she wasn't returning to the train platform. Not yet. Not like that. She didn't say it aloud, not even to herself, but something inside her had shifted. Just a little, enough to stay, enough to try. The boarding house smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke. It wasn't grand, 2 stories leaning slightly into the wind, shutters in need of paint. But it was warm. the kind of place that had been cared for, not because it was fancy, but because someone had made it matter. Martha Webb met her at the door, flower on her sleeves and a firm smile on her face. "You must be Ella Morgan," she said, stepping aside so Ella could enter. "Gabriel said you were coming. Said you were tall and tired and didn't need another. Door slammed in your face." Ella blinked. "That's accurate." "Well, we don't stoop for strangers here," Martha said, leading her inside. "And we sure as hell don't shrink for fools." The room she was given was small but clean, with a bed that creaked but held firm and a window that looked out toward the hills. The next morning, sunlight came through the curtains like a quiet promise, and Ella lay there a moment before rising, stiff from travel, heavy with the memory of rejection but breathing. Still here? Downstairs, Martha slid a plate in front of her without asking. Eggs, toast, thick coffee. She talked while she worked. Something about her late husband raising every doorframe in the house after bumping his head one too many times. Said he got tired of living like a hunchback, Martha recalled with a laugh. "So you don't have to duck here, just live." Ella wasn't used to ease, wasn't used to kindness without caveats, but she nodded. "Thank you." After breakfast, she offered to help. Not with dishes, Martha waved her off, but with something that mattered. "I sew," Ella said. "Practical garments. I used to do alterations back in Boston." Martha's eyebrows rose. "That dusty little room off the porch used to be a sewing space. Good light. I never used it for anything useful after my eyes went. I wouldn't want to impose—" "Nonsense," Martha cut in, already walking away. "I'll show you after lunch. Besides, my winter coat's a mess, and I've got no patience for tiny stitches anymore." By midday, the room had been swept clean, the windows opened to let out the dust, and Ella had unpacked the bolts of fabric and thread she'd brought all the way across the country. Sturdy wools, faded cotton, a few scraps of calico folded like hope. She organized her tools, ran a hand across her worn measuring tape, and sat in the quiet space that smelled of cedar and potential. The first knock came before she'd even threaded her needle. A local woman stood in the doorway with a torn hem and hopeful eyes. "Heard you might be able to help," she said. By that evening, Ella had altered 2 skirts, patched a work shirt, and agreed to look at a pair of trousers with knees that had seen too many winters. Word spread faster than she expected. By noon the next day, she had a line. She worked quietly, efficiently. There was something soothing about the rhythm of it, the tug and slide of needle through fabric, the way worn things could be made useful again. And while the stares hadn't disappeared, the whispers still followed her down Main Street, still lingered at the edge of every conversation. Something had begun to change. Respect, however small, had started to bloom. When Gabriel returned, 2 days later, his shirt dusted in sawdust and his voice as steady as ever, he didn't bother with small talk. "You're staying," he said. "I am," she replied. He nodded, approving. "Good." He looked down at the coat in her lap, half-mended, the stitches neat and firm. "I've got a dozen men up north who tear through their gear like wolves. Buttons gone, sleeves split, pants hanging on by threads. None of them can stitch a straight line to save their lives." Ella waited. "We could use a seamstress, someone with hands like yours. I can offer steady work, fair coin." She blinked. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering a trade," he said. "Your skill, my coin, that's fair, isn't it?" She smiled slightly. "Yes, it is." He hesitated before turning to go, then added, "There's a church social next Saturday. The whole town turns out. Good place to meet people. Maybe take a few more orders." "You going?" "Not usually my scene," he said, "but maybe this time." He didn't wait for her answer, and she didn't offer one. But something lingered in the air after he left. Something that hadn't been there before. Not quite romance. Not yet. But a hum of something beginning. The next few days passed in a blur. Women brought dresses, men brought torn shirts. A boy no older than 10 arrived clutching a pair of overalls and a crumpled dollar. Ella worked late into the evenings, fingers sore, eyes strained, but her spirit steadier than it had been in years. She heard the names people called her. The Giant seamstress, the tall one in Martha Webb's place, but they didn't sting as sharply anymore. She was being talked about, yes, but now people were saying her stitches held better than anyone else's. That she didn't waste time with nonsense. That she listened, didn't gossip, worked hard, and stood tall, literally and otherwise. One evening, Martha poked her head into the sewing room, cheeks flushed from the cold. "That Mr. Blackwood sent word," she said. "One of his men will bring down a pile of repairs next week." "Already?" Ella asked. "Said he told his boys best stitching west of Portland. Seems you've got yourself a fan." Ella didn't answer at first, just looked down at the fabric in her lap, the stitch she was about to finish. A smile curved at the corner of her mouth. No husband, no home in Boston anymore. But here, in a town carved out of timber and expectation, she had a needle, a purpose, and maybe, just maybe, the beginnings of something real. The sky was a sharp, endless blue the afternoon of the church social, scrubbed clean by a cold wind and lit by the kind of winter sun that made everything look a little more honest. Inside her room at the boarding house, Ella stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the fabric of the dress she'd chosen carefully, deep burgundy wool with copper embroidery stitched by her own hand. It wasn't new, but it was hers. It fit without pinching. It draped without apology. She'd sewn every seam herself, reinforced every hem, and as she pinned her hair up with steady fingers, she left a few curls to fall loose and soft against her cheek. She did not wear a corset. She did not slouch or bend her knees to appear smaller. For the first time in a long time, she had no desire to disappear into a room. She intended to enter it fully. The church hall was already full when she arrived. Long tables lined with pies and roasts, fiddles tuning up in the corner, voices overlapping in the hum of neighbors pretending not to judge and yet watching everything. She stepped through the doorway and the room shifted. Just a little, just enough to notice. Heads turned. Conversations paused for the length of a breath. She felt it, the weight of eyes. The town had not forgotten who she was, where she came from, how she arrived, and what had happened on that train platform. But this time the hush didn't pierce her. It slid off the surface of her certainty like rain from waxed cloth. She stood taller. Let them look. Martha Webb swept in beside her, cheeks flushed from the warmth of the room. "You look magnificent," she whispered, looping her arm through Ella's. "You're going to make them regret every word they ever muttered behind your back." "That's not the goal," Ella said. "No," Martha said with a wicked grin, "but it's a nice bonus." They moved through the crowd together, Martha making introductions with the ease of someone who had known everyone for too long to pretend otherwise. The doctor's wife asked about dress repairs. The school teacher wanted a new shawl. An elderly woman with stiff fingers asked Ella if she could make curtains for the church kitchen. One shorter woman, eyes level with Ella's collarbone, leaned in and said, "You know, I never could reach the top pantry shelf. You're already a blessing." Ella laughed, surprised by how easily it came. And then the music changed. Or maybe the room did. Gabriel Blackwood stepped through the entrance, tall and steady in clean trousers and a shirt that had clearly been pressed by someone else's hands. He looked like the Woods had put on Sunday clothes, still rough around the edges but unmistakably present. And he was looking straight at her. He crossed the room without hesitation, the crowd parting as if recognizing something they couldn't quite name. He stopped in front of her, removed his hat, and said in his low, certain voice, "Miss Morgan, you look well." "As do you," she replied, her voice catching slightly. "I didn't expect you to come." "I said I might," he said. "Didn't say I wouldn't. It wasn't romantic, not in the way stories often are, but it landed, somewhere deep." The Reverend nodded toward the open floor. The fiddles struck up something gentle and warm. Gabriel looked at her. "Would you care to dance?" She hesitated. "It's been a while." "Then we'll be rusty together." She took his hand. It fit. They moved slowly at first, finding rhythm without effort, each step meeting the other without collision or hesitation. Her eyes were level with his. For once, she didn't have to look down. He didn't lead her like a man trying to control the moment. He walked with her like someone who respected the steps they were taking together. There was something steady in it. Something safe. "You're staring," he murmured as they turned. "I'm not used to this," she said. "Most men can't handle dancing with a tall woman." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "Most men are fools." She laughed, quiet and real. They moved through the song, and when it ended, he didn't let go right away. They walked toward the refreshment table, shoulders nearly brushing, and she reached for a glass of cider just as the corner of the room shifted again. William Prescott stood near the back pews. His expression wasn't surprised. It was sharp, like a knife that had waited too long to cut. He made his way through the crowd slowly, smile carefully pinned in place, eyes too focused to be casual. "Miss Morgan," he said. "Mr. Blackwood. Didn't expect to see either of you tonight." Gabriel's shoulders tensed, but he didn't move. "We're here like everyone else." "Of course," William said, still smiling, though some might say the sight of certain pairs might make tongues wag. Ella tilted her head slightly, voice even. "Let them wag. I've been talked about my entire life. It doesn't change who I am." William's smile thinned. "Silver Creek has its traditions." "Then maybe it's time those traditions caught up," she replied. His eyes flicked to Gabriel, then back to her. "Well, enjoy the dance floor, Miss Morgan. Though I do wonder, do your feet even fit on it?" The words were meant to wound, to make her flinch, but they landed without heat. Gabriel stepped forward, jaw tight, but she touched his arm gently and held her ground. She looked William in the eye. "I'd rather have feet too big for the floor," she said, "than a heart too small for the truth." William's face colored. He turned sharply and walked away, boots loud against the floorboards. Gabriel let out a breath. "You handled that better than I would have." She turned to him, calm but bright. "You give me courage." He smiled. "You already had it. I just reminded you." And in that moment, with music rising again and laughter echoing softly from the far end of the hall, she felt something loosen inside her. Not because she had won something, but because she had no longer needed to shrink to be allowed to stay. That night, as they stepped out into the cold together, her breath rising in the moonlight, Gabriel walked her home. At the gate, he paused, quiet as always, and said, "Thank you for the dance." "Thank you for showing up," she replied. "It meant more than you know." He looked at her then, not with longing, not yet, but with something steadier. Reverence. "You are remarkable, Miss Morgan." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. He tipped his hat and turned, disappearing into the dark, while behind her Martha opened the door and called, "Well, you've got him thinking about more than lumber tonight." Ella smiled, not wide, not loud, just enough, and she walked inside, not shrinking, not stooping, but filling every inch of space that was always meant to be hers. The days that followed passed like a quiet snowfall, gentle, slow, and impossible to ignore. The air turned sharper, mornings arriving with frost-laced windows, and Ella's routine became its own kind of comfort. She stitched from morning to dusk, her needle threading through fabric and silence with equal grace. The little sewing room off the porch glowed in the winter light, warmed by her presence and the steady hum of purpose. Word of her skill spread like wood smoke through Silver Creek. People brought more than clothes now. They brought trust, tiny offerings of respect folded into garments and thanks. Gabriel didn't visit often, but when he did, it was never for long and never unnecessary. A delivery of torn jackets, a quiet remark about the weather, a brief smile at the doorway. But each time he came, something softened in her, like a knot loosening under warmth. He didn't hover. He didn't flatter. He just showed up, present and whole, and in doing so, carved out a space beside her without asking for permission. He left her a note once, tucked neatly between fabric bolts. "You stitch cleaner than most men swing an axe. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She found herself reading it more than once. Then one day he stopped coming. The second Saturday of the month arrived with a storm, snow falling heavy and fast, blanketing the rooftops, clogging the roads. It was the kind of weather that turned towns quiet, fires lit behind every window. Ella kept to the sewing room, glancing now and then toward the door, though she told herself not to expect anything. He'd said he might return, said he'd stop by. But the hours slipped by and no footsteps came up the walk. It was near dusk when the knock came. 3 sharp raps at the door, urgent and cold. Martha opened it to reveal a young man, no older than 20, snow clinging to his coat, cheeks red and raw from the wind. His eyes searched the room until they found Ella. "Miss Morgan?" She stood before she even answered. "It's Mr. Blackwood," the man said. "There's been an accident." The words took the air out of her lungs. Her heart stuttered. But she didn't crumble. "He's alive," the man added quickly. "But hurt. Bad. Trees slid near Raven Ridge. He got the others out, but—" Martha was already grabbing her medical bag. Ella said nothing. She simply pulled on her boots, wrapped her scarf around her throat, and followed them into the storm. Snow reached her knees in places, drifts leaning heavy against buildings. The doctor's house was lit like a beacon, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, warmth met her with the weight of pine, sweat, blood, and antiseptic. 4 men huddled near the fire, their faces hollow with exhaustion. "He's asking for you," Mary Simmons said, stepping into view. Her voice was calm, her apron stained, and her eyes unreadable. Ella didn't pause. She crossed the room, into the back where Gabriel lay on a narrow cot, body too big for the frame. His leg was splinted, torso wrapped in bandages, brow creased in pain. But his eyes found hers the second she stepped into the room. "You came," he whispered. "Of course I did," she said, sitting beside him, taking his hand. He tried to smile. "Not as bad as it looks." "You're a terrible liar," she said softly, brushing a bit of hair from his forehead. "You should stick to forestry." He chuckled, then winced. "I'll be fine," he said. "Just hate lying still." "Then, you'll have to learn patience," she murmured. "Fortunately, I'm good at teaching it." The room was warm, the fire crackling in the corner. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, there was only this, the quiet tether between them, his hand. In hers, the way his breath slowed just slightly with her presence. "I thought about you," he said, suddenly serious. "Every day," her voice faltered as she replied. "I thought about you too." The doctor stepped in, clearing his throat gently. "That's enough for now, Miss Morgan. He needs rest." Gabriel's fingers held tight to hers as she rose. "Come back tomorrow?" "I'll come back every day," she said. And she did. Every morning she returned, often before the sun had risen fully. Some days she brought stew, other days, books, sometimes nothing but herself. She sat beside him and read aloud or sewed, quietly in the corner, or simply listened while he talked about the camp, the trees, the river bend near the ridge where the light caught the water like glass. He recovered slowly, but steadily. The bruises began to fade. The pain dulled, and with it, something else grew, between them, unspoken but constant, a trust that hadn't needed naming, but not everyone welcomed it. The town noticed. The whispers, that had once labeled her the giant seamstress, now wondered if she was something else, a woman spending her days at the bedside of an unmarried man. How improper, how bold, how dangerous. Martha dismissed it all with a snort and a chopping knife. "They don't know what to do with a woman who walks taller than their expectations," she muttered, dicing carrots for soup. But Ella felt it. The glances. The sidelong comments wrapped in courtesy. She'd carried heavier burdens. Still, some days they pressed harder than others. Mary Simmons was always nearby, efficient, composed, unfailingly polite. Her apron always clean by the time Ella arrived, her voice always measured. She never said anything cruel. But Ella could feel it in the way Mary stood just a little too close to Gabriel. in the way her hand lingered when she adjusted his bandages, in the quiet knowledge that Mary had once been something more. It was like walking through a room already full of someone else's history. Then there was William. He no longer ignored her. On the contrary, he seemed to take quiet pleasure in watching her stand under scrutiny. Each time they passed on the boardwalk, he tipped his hat with that same smirk he wore on the train platform. Some folks just can't help but make a spectacle of themselves, he said once, loud enough for others to hear. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. But the words clung. Inside the doctor's house, she found solace. Gabriel, even bruised and broken, had a gravity that steadied her. He smiled. It reached his eyes. When he listened, it wasn't out of politeness, it was because he truly cared. She mended his shirts while he slept. She brought clean linens, watched over him like a sentinel. And slowly, he healed. But with healing came another tension. On the 18th day, the doctor cleared his throat and announced, "He's stable enough to leave. No stares, no excitement. Someone needs to keep an eye on him." Gabriel looked toward Ella, then to Martha. "I have a room prepared," Martha said, not missing a beat. "Back parlor, pull-out couch, plenty of light." "You never mentioned that," Ella said. "Didn't want you worrying while he was still bleeding through the bandages." He was moved the next morning. 2 loggers carried him in with pride and jokes, setting him carefully on the couch while Martha fussed over blankets, and Ella fluffed pillows with hands that trembled only slightly. The house felt smaller with him in it, but warmer too. By the 3rd day he was restless. By the 4th, brooding. "I need my crutch," he said. "You're not walking yet," Ella replied, arms crossed. "I can try." "You're not trying anything until that leg heals." He grumbled but obeyed. That afternoon, snow fell in thick silence outside the windows. They played cards while Martha stirred stew, Gabriel accusing Ella of bluffing like a bandit. She smiled. "I've spent my whole life pretending I wasn't hurt. You think I can't fake a flush?" They laughed. For a moment it felt like they were the only 2 people in the world, until the knock came. Martha opened the door. William Prescott stood on the porch, coat pristine, eyes sharp. "I've come to speak with Mr. Blackwood," he said. "Why?" Martha asked. "Town business. You can speak here, or not at all." William stepped inside, his gaze flicking to Ella. She didn't stand, didn't flinch, just kept mending Gabriel's shirt, needles sliding in and out with quiet precision. "Well," William said, "isn't this cozy?" Gabriel didn't move. "Say what you came to say." "The Railroad Commission vote is in 4 days. You've missed every meeting, every draft. Some might say you've forfeited your voice." "I'll be there," Gabriel said. "In your condition?" "I'll be there." William's mouth curled. "Never underestimate the power of inspiration." Ella rose slowly. "Careful, Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice like tempered steel. "You're mistaking kindness for weakness again." He didn't reply, just turned, coat snapping behind him, and let the door slam as he left. Gabriel leaned back, exhaled. "He's going to try something. We'll be ready." He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked. "You're not afraid, are you?" "No," she said, quiet but sure. "Not anymore." Snow fell in soft, deliberate silence the morning Gabriel was carried into the Webb boarding house. 2 loggers brought him through the front door in a stretcher fashioned from an old sled and rope, grumbling good-naturedly about the weight, while their boots left wet tracks on the wooden floor. Martha directed them with the efficiency of a field general, pointing to the back parlor, where a sturdy couch had been pulled out and layered with extra quilts. The space was cramped, but it was warm, and the windows let in the kind of light that made winter feel less like a threat. Ella was already there, straightening pillows and folding clean linens at the foot of the bed. Her movements were quiet but precise, every corner tucked, every edge smoothed. She didn't fuss. She simply prepared. Gabriel's eyes followed her as they lowered him onto the couch, his jaw tight against the pane, but he didn't complain. When the others stepped back, he looked around the room and gave a tired nod. "Could be worse." "It will be," Martha said, "if you try to walk before I say you can." The days took on a new rhythm. Gabriel slept through most of them, at first drifting in and out with the aid of herbs and exhaustion. Ella kept watch, mending quietly by the window, or reading aloud in a voice low enough not to disturb the storm outside. She brought tea, fresh bread, a journal for him to write in. He never asked for any of it, but he never asked her to leave either. Outside the boarding house, the town murmured. It started with glances, escalated to comments. She's not his wife. What kind of woman spends her nights beside a man like that? It's not right. People never said it directly, but she heard it anyway, in the pause before a greeting, in the hush that followed her footsteps at the general store. She walked taller through it, not to be proud, but because she refused to bend. Inside, the house remained a kind of sanctuary. Martha treated Gabriel like any other stubborn man with a broken limb and a poor sense of timing. Ella remained steady, her voice and presence the constant he didn't know he needed until she wasn't in the room. And yet, even that space wasn't safe from all shadows. Mary Simmons came by often, too often. She brought broth, newspapers, a carefully folded quilt she claimed to have sewn herself, though Ella recognized the stitching as someone else's work. She smiled too easily, said all the right things. But there was history in the way she touched Gabriel's shoulder, in the way she hovered too long after setting something down. She didn't confront Ella. She didn't need to. Her very presence was a reminder. I was here before you. Ella didn't rise to it. She listened, nodded, said thank you when appropriate, and went right back to stitching. It was William who crossed the line. He arrived in the middle of the week, unannounced, hat dusted with snow and eyes already gleaming with something smug. Martha met him at the door, arms crossed, but he brushed past her with the casual arrogance of a man used to being let in. He found them in the parlor, Gabriel reclining stiffly on the couch, Ella seated beside him, a half-mended shirt draped over her lap. She didn't rise. Well, William said, glancing around. I can't say I'm surprised. Cozier than I expected, though. Martha always did know how to arrange a room. Gabriel didn't shift, but his jaw tensed. Say what you came to say. The council votes in 4 days, William said, pacing with affected calm. And you've missed every meeting. You haven't reviewed the maps, the paperwork. Some might say you've lost your place. Gabriel's voice was low but firm. I'll be there. In your condition? I'll be there. William smiled, sharp and insincere. Well, with motivation like this, I suppose anything's possible. He let his gaze linger on Ella, as if expecting her to flinch. She didn't. Instead, she set the shirt aside and stood slowly, towering over him without effort, without needing to try. Her voice was even. Be careful, Mr. Prescott. You're mistaking kindness for weakness again. He blinked, then scoffed. You think you've won something, don't you? A place? A cause? A man? I don't need to win, she said. I just need to stand where I belong. William stared at her, something dark flickering in his eyes, then turned and let himself out, door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. The room was quiet again. Gabriel leaned his head back against the cushion, eyes closed, breathing slow and deep. Then he looked at her and something shifted in his expression, something beyond gratitude. A flicker of something that might have been admiration, or maybe more. You're not afraid, are you? He asked. She met his gaze and answered without hesitation. Not anymore. Snow covered Silver Creek like a heavy quilt, blanketing the rooftops, silencing the streets, but it did nothing to hush the tension that rippled through the town. Everyone knew what was coming. The vote on the railroad expansion had stirred. Whispers for weeks. More money, more industry, more outsiders. But at what cost? Gabriel's injury had kept him from the meetings, and many assumed he'd forfeited his place at the table. William Prescott had been counting on that. But Gabriel wasn't about to be counted out. Ella stood behind him as he adjusted the collar of his coat. His leg was still stiff, his movement slow, but his jaw was set with purpose. Two of his men helped him into the modified chair Martha had rigged from an old cart, and when they wheeled him through the town square, people paused. Some nodded, some didn't know what to make of it. But they moved aside because there was something in the way he sat, injured but proud, that reminded everyone of who he was. The town hall was packed, standing room only. Maps had been tacked up on the walls, red lines slicing through old forest and farmland. William stood at the front in his finest coat, hair neat, smile tight. He welcomed the crowd with the smoothness of someone who had already practiced his victory speech. "We gather," he said, "to decide what kind of future Silver Creek will embrace. Progress is coming, whether we vote for it or not." Gabriel was wheeled to the front, his injured leg extended, his face pale but resolute. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. "You all know me," he began. "I've hauled timber out of these woods, pulled men from floods, helped bury friends when winter came too early. I've fought fires with wet blankets and bare hands. I don't wear suits, I don't give speeches, but I do know this land, and I know when it's being taken for too little." He pointed to the map, to the bold red line that cut through old growth and ran straight across Raven Ridge. "They'll take the trees, flatten the hills, and when they're done, they'll leave. What then? What will be left for us? For our children? You think they're building this for you? They're building it through you." Murmurs stirred across the room. Heads turned. William shifted, his jaw tightening. Then Ella stepped forward. She didn't need permission. No one called her to speak. She simply walked to the center of the room, her boots steady on the wooden floor, her presence impossible to ignore. Silence fell without being asked. "I came here a stranger," she said. "I stepped off a train with hope in my pocket and was dismissed before I could even unpack my suitcase. I was too tall, too different, too much." She paused. No one looked away. But I stayed. Not because it was easy, not because I was welcomed, but because I saw something here worth standing for. This land, this community, these people. You don't need fast money. You need something that lasts. You need to believe that who you are is enough, not something to sell off for short-term gain. Her voice didn't tremble. Her height wasn't something she shrank from. It gave weight to her words. She turned to the council, then to the crowd. "You have a man here who has bled for this place, who understands balance, between future and forest, between growth and wisdom. If you turn away from that, you're not just cutting down trees, you're cutting down the roots of your own town." There was a long silence, then a single nod, then more. A few murmured agreements, some clapped, some simply stood still, absorbing it. William stepped forward again, composed but colder now. "Let's not forget," he said smoothly, "that the ones who shout the loudest aren't from here. They don't understand our history." Gabriel raised his head. "You're right. I wasn't born here, but I chose to be here. I stayed. Through 10 winters, through loss, through every vote that mattered. Can you say the same?" The room was still again. Judge Porter, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, banged his gavel. "We've heard enough. The council will deliberate." They disappeared behind a side door. The room buzzed with tension. Ella stood by Gabriel's side, her hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His fingers brushed against hers just once, and that was enough. When the council returned, Judge Porter cleared his throat. "By a vote of 3-2, he said, "the proposal for the northern expansion is denied. The southern route will proceed." The room erupted, not in wild cheers but in something deeper. Relief, vindication, quiet applause and shared glances. Ella closed her eyes for a moment just to breathe. Gabriel leaned back, his expression unreadable but his hand steady. She squeezed his shoulder gently. They had done it. The town would remain rooted. The forest would stand. And though nothing had been promised, nothing named, something undeniable had been proven. that strength didn't always come from loud voices or power plays. Sometimes it came from standing tall when everyone expected you to shrink. Gabriel moved into the boarding house on a cold morning thick with fog. No announcement was made, no ceremony. One day he simply didn't leave. His things arrived in a canvas sack slung over one of his logger's shoulders, and Martha cleared a space in the back room without saying a word. The couch had long since become his resting place, and now it became something else, a part of his life, a part of hers. He healed slowly, stubbornly. The limp remained, slight but visible, and he hated using the cane Martha insisted he keep nearby, but he didn't complain. He worked his way back to strength with the same patience he used to mend fences and settle disputes at the camp. He split wood again before spring, helped repair the barn roof before the thaw, walked into the general store like he'd never left. And everywhere he went, people nodded, greeted him with respect. Not just because he'd spoken up at the vote, but because he hadn't stopped showing up. Ella kept to her sewing room, but business picked up more than ever. The women came not just with repairs but with requests: new dresses, baby quilts, winter cloaks. The men came with work pants, ripped sleeves, buttons gone. She never promised more than she could deliver, but she always delivered more than expected. She listened. She worked. And she stood. The townsfolk began to treat her not like a curiosity but like a necessity. Her name was spoken with appreciation. Her height, once a point of whispered judgment, became something people mentioned with a kind of pride, as if her presence made the town itself stand taller. Children waved at her when she passed. The pastor's wife asked her to speak at the ladies' gathering. The schoolteacher offered to hang one of her handmade quilts in the library reading corner. Slowly, the town began to wrap around her, not tightly, not possessively, but like a coat that finally fit. Gabriel came and went, sometimes vanishing for hours to check on the camp, other times sitting quietly beside her in the sewing room while she worked. He read aloud when her eyes were tired. She packed his lunch without asking. They didn't speak about what was forming between them. They didn't have to. There was no confession, no grand moment of declaration. Only small things: his hand brushing hers when he passed the sugar, the way she leaned toward his voice in the evening, the way their eyes found each other across the dinner table and rested there a second too long. One night, as snow melted in quiet rivulets down the panes, she looked up from her stitching and found him watching her. He said nothing, just smiled, and she smiled back, slow and certain. Whatever it was between them, it didn't need to be rushed. It wasn't something to chase, it was already here, unfolding gently like spring just beginning to show its face beneath the frost. She no longer ducked through doorways. She no longer angled herself to fit into someone else's comfort. She walked into rooms as she was, tall, confident, kind. She wore her best dresses, not to impress, but because they made her feel like herself. She spoke when she had something to say, and when she was silent, people listened anyway. She had not come to Silver Creek to be accepted. She had come because she needed somewhere to belong. And in the long silence after rejection, she'd built something better than acceptance. She'd earned respect, earned purpose, earned her own peace. There was still talk, there would always be talk, but it didn't reach her anymore, not in the way it once had. It moved around her like wind around stone, something that once might have knocked her off balance but now simply passed. In the evenings, Gabriel sometimes stood with her on the porch, watching the sunset turn the trees gold. He didn't say much. Neither did she. But he stood close enough that their shoulders touched, and when the light faded, they went inside together. Nothing was promised, but everything was possible. And Ella, at last, was not afraid to take up space in the world. She had chosen to stay in. She did not apologize. She did not bow. She lived fully, loudly, gently, just as she was. Enough.